Walter, I can't help but think, hearing Hans talking about an engineer who was more interested in supply chains and foreign policy, of thinking of JFK's Secretary of Defense, Robert McNamara.
Right, exactly. You know, I was just reading a book about Richard Holbrooke, and it's all about the McNamara mentality, what Halberstam called the best and the brightest that come in. That said, I don't know Shanahan, but he seems like a very smart person. And if he is somebody who can figure out not just supply chains, but exactly how to do the Pentagon in the 21st century, how to do procurement, how to bring it into an innovation age, how to take it out of the mindset of aircraft carriers being built and being judged on how many aircraft carriers we have. He may be good, but what we actually need at this moment is not just that, but somebody who can provide some safety around Donald Trump, somebody who has some vision of the role of our allies in the world. So perhaps Shanahan can rise to that challenge. He seems like a smart person with many of the skills we need in the Pentagon for a 21st century military. Maybe he can bring in a deputy secretary. And real quickly, let me just add that Michelle Flournoy, that notion that she was going to be deputy secretary, that was that wonderful dream at the beginning of this administration that maybe it would govern as an independent administration and even bring some Democrats in.
Yeah, no, I agree with Walter here. We have this romanticized view that a president will surround himself with rivals. It rarely is the case, but that's what we've been brought up to believe is important. In Trump's case, he's kind of dispelled with that within a year and a half. And we have acting people now who will be running the Department of Defense, essentially the EPA. We have an acting attorney general. We have Jared Kushner given like 20 different mega responsibilities. Mick Mulvaney handling 3 different important jobs. The universe of advisors that Trump has surrounded himself with is both smaller, and they're more likely to be people who share his worldview. And I think part of the problem, and this is something I want to throw to Richard here, I think part of the problem is that there's just simply not a universe of Republican seasoned operatives, but also officials who share Trump's worldview so he can pick from. I mean, that seems to me a big issue, is that people don't necessarily want to work with Trump because they don't agree with the policies he's pursuing. So that's why you have to find a DOD secretary who is a businessman. That's why you have to find an attorney general who has written memos criticizing the Mueller probe. He is selecting from a very finite universe of people, and there just aren't that many.
And the Republican Party's been split 3 ways on foreign policy now for decades. You have the realists, like the former President 41, who just died.
Yeah.
You had the neocons closer to 43 who wanted to transform the world. Trump is really out of the Buchanan wing of the Republican Party. And that's not the foreign policy mainstream. And there's not that many to choose from. Plus, as you said, you've now got this whole overlay. You've got Jared Kushner and his being offline. You have a national security advisor who doesn't convene national security meetings. That Bob Woodward was getting at this. There's virtually no process in the administration. You've got diplomacy by Twitter, which is something. And also, look at 2018. We lost the Secretary of State, Secretary of Defense, and the national security advisor.
I guess my question is, if you're wanting to go work in DOD and you look at how James Mattis, who was going to, play it out and do as best he could and stay there for the good of the country, he couldn't last 2 years. What does that say to you? Is that this is an uncontrollable environment and I shouldn't be part of it?
Well, look, public service at this level is attractive, and the president alluded to that yesterday, but public service in this administration can be dangerous to your health.
Right.
I mean, I was going to turn it to Bob Woodward. Bob has thought more about administrations than anybody else in Washington. Is there any historical parallel, Bob, that comes to mind here? Do you see anything here that when you look back over the, 6, 8 presidents that you've watched up close, do you see anything that echoes, or is this really sui generis? Is this really something qualitatively different?
Well, and the theory of the case, to the extent that Trump has one, and he expressed it interestingly yesterday, that he thinks we're suckers. He uses that word. I quote him at NSC meetings in the last 2 years talking about we're suckers because we have these international military agreements like NATO, and he thinks we're paying for the military for other countries. And of course, Mattis in the generals would say to him, no, no, those are bargains. That is for our security. Richard, no one knows better than you how this old international order, sorry to use the term, how it worked. It prevented major wars for 70 years. It was Mattis who took Trump over to the Pentagon his first year and tried to educate him and say, look, we have these security agreements, we have the trade agreements, we have the top secret intelligence partnerships. This works. Yes, you want to change some things, but Trump sat there and just said it's all BS and got angry. And so what you have here is the non-functioning of the national security apparatus in a way that couldn't be more dangerous, quite frankly.
Well, and Bob talks about how Donald Trump considers us suckers and talks about the international order as working and as preventing global wars. The thing that Donald Trump overlooks, because he's quite actually ignorant of history and he's ignorant of foreign policy, and he's actually ignorant, believe it or not, of global finance, because he had a mom and pop operation without the mom, as we say here all the time. His dad gave him $200 million and he somehow squandered that and got $9 billion in debt. But for anybody that knows global finance, that works in global finance day in, day out, they will also tell you that this order that America has led, this international order, not only prevents global wars, but it has allowed the United States of America to grow into the strongest economic engine in the history of mankind. We have a GDP of almost $20 trillion, and we, quote, suckers, as American taxpayers, are paying 3% of our budget to not only stop World War III, but to also protect and promote American economic interests across the globe that have an impact in the day in and day out lives of American workers. And that's something that Donald Trump will never understand. And certainly, Yamiche, something that those around him will never understand, because Sam Stein was talking about how his advisors, it's one of the smallest group of advisors around any president. Bob Woodward said they don't call regular meetings at the National Security Council. And it may not only be one of the smallest and one of the most isolated, but it is also one of the least experienced. Now, I won't say one of, it is the least experienced foreign policy team in modern American history. This would be like you or me going to get brain surgery from a doctor who had never performed that surgery before and say, go at it. That's who's running our foreign policy right now, neophytes.
Well, I think that you could say that President Trump doesn't even have an A team or a B team or a C team. He's on D&E right now, and it's because there are two things. There's one, the fact that President Trump is not, unfortunately, taken seriously by many of the people who would want to work at the White House, and other times Republicans around the country who are wary of going into a White House where Donald Trump is going to be doing basically whatever he wants to do at the end of the day. So I think you have that going on, but then you also have the idea that this isn't just part of this isn't just his foreign policy. This is an issue that seeps into his communications team. It's an issue that seeps into his legal team. So you have someone who became president and who in his mind says, well, I promised that I was going to get out of Syria, so I just need to do it right away, no matter what the people that are closest to me say. I just need to tell the people that I visited all across the country at my rallies that I did what I told them to do, and I did what I said I was going to do. So I think you have that. I think add to that the fact that when you look at his comments to troops, you have a highly political speech that he gave to the troops, talking about Nancy Pelosi, saying that he wants the wall still, talking about the fact that you're fighting for borders here, but the Democrats don't want borders in our country. I think there's no other way to look at his conversation with the troops but as a political rally that was held in Iraq.
Right. A political rally held in Iraq, and it was Bush League. And, you know, Yamiche, you bring up such a great point, because we're talking about inexperienced and incompetent people running the president's foreign policy, being in charge of Middle East policy. But you talk about his legal team as well. He's had an incompetent legal team for some time, which is going to end up costing him greatly in the end. But what about Matthew Whitaker, a guy that many of my friends from Washington say day in and day out, of all of the scandals that have unfolded during Donald Trump's almost 2 years in the White House, having a guy like that as your acting attorney general may be the greatest, that he is woefully ill-equipped to be the top law enforcement officer in this country.
And I think it's that there's this idea that, one, President Trump can't actually get people to work with him, because there are people that I've talked to, lawyers that we've talked to at PBS, who literally said the White House tried to hire us and we said no because we understand that the client isn't going to listen to us. There's this idea that President Trump, while he is president, he's also his own chief of staff, his own communications director, now almost his own secretary of defense. He's doing all of this and thinking, as long as I can get the messaging out there, as long as I can say that we're winning, and as long as I can really make it look as though it's a great, smooth transition in this White House, a smooth operation, then maybe people will actually believe that. But what we're seeing is that obviously things are not running smoothly, and that the president is trying his best to put on a good face when there are all sorts of small mini crises. When I say mini, I mean more like sectored off crises happening in the White House.
Yeah. Eamon, let me bring you in here. As we talk about crises, let's talk about global crises, but specifically, let's focus on the Middle East. With Donald Trump retreating from Syria, with Vladimir Putin not only expanding his influence there, but also in Saudi Arabia, what does the future of the Middle East look like? With a war in Yemen, with rising tensions between Saudi Arabia and Iran, with Assad and Putin and Erdogan, and the mullahs of Iran cutting up, balkanizing Syria. What's that future look like?
In short, it's not a very optimistic one. It's very bleak. It's very grim. You can almost throw a dart anywhere on the map in the Middle East, and you are not likely to hit anywhere that is on the up and up to show any signs of improvement. I mean, even in some of our closest allies, like Israel, now going to early elections, the political upheaval there that has been triggered by all the effects in the region are being felt. So when you look at a country from Libya that is completely lawless, Yemen in the middle of a humanitarian disaster, the situation in Syria doesn't get any better. The refugee spillover, the humanitarian crisis, the lack of any democratic process, and many of these countries within themselves having rivalries. We talk about the GCC a lot. Those countries, Saudi Arabia, the United Arab Emirates, at odds with Qatar. And against that backdrop, you have regional players like Iran, like Russia, that are now trying to shape the outcome of so many of these interstate conflicts. Iran is continuing to try to quote Richard here, Hezbollah's Syria, to try to create a proxy in Syria that can pose a threat to Israel. Israel is obviously not going to stand by, and they've been carrying out military strikes inside Syria. So we're seeing the region push more and more to the brink of direct confrontation beyond the war zones that we've seen over the last 10 years in Syria, in Yemen, and Libya, and in some of these Arab Spring countries. So I would say that we are not in any upward trajectory. We're in a downward spiral across the region for the most part, Joe.
I want to talk to Richard Haass and Bob Woodward next about the unraveling of the Middle East. It's interesting that it's come 40 years after the Camp David Accords. We celebrated the 40th anniversary of that this past September, and there hasn't been a ground war in the Middle East since, a significant one, obviously, between Israel or their Arab enemies in the past. What's the future look like? We're going to be talking again to Bob Woodward, Richard Haass, and others. But Eamon, first, I want to thank you for being with us. Still ahead on Morning Joe, the stock market makes a comeback with the Dow surging more than 1,000 points yesterday. It was the largest single point day gain ever. We've got Brian Sullivan coming in to talk to us about that. Plus, Matt Whitaker, we spoke about him a moment ago. His resume says he was an academic All-American. Official records say, no, he wasn't. The latest on the acting AG's bio. You're watching Morning Joe. We shall return.
Thanks for checking out MSNBC on YouTube, and make sure you subscribe to stay up to date on the day's biggest stories. And you can click on any of the videos around us to watch more from Morning Joe and MSNBC. Thanks so much for watching.